So welcome everybody. I am Sari Carp. I am the Executive Director of Sustainability Matters, and I will also be your presenter today. Sustainability Matters, for those of you who are new to us, is a small environmental education nonprofit with, we like to think, a pretty big impact. Our focus is on giving individuals and farmers and businesses the tools to really make a difference in the environment in your own little piece of the world without having to wait for the government to change the laws or somebody else to do something, but just to make a difference for the planet and for yourselves and really improve your own lives, create more beauty around you, and in many cases make your lives easier. So we focus on really practical, realistic, achievable education for everybody, and try to make it as inclusive of all different people as possible. And we know that today, we have participants, like I said, from all over the world. We ourselves are a 4-year-old nonprofit based in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And until the pandemic, we did mostly in-person events on all different topics. Since the pandemic, we have proverbially pivoted and are now hosting webinars for a global audience, still mostly in the United States, but we know, we usually have quite a crowd of Australians. I think there are a few here today, but they are probably up in the middle of the night if they are. We're excited that at this time in what is the afternoon on the East Coast of the United States, we have a number of Europeans as well. But the information that we'll be providing is pretty general and should really work for audiences and places. Obviously, what plants will grow in your environment will vary based on where you live. And that's something that, we're not going to go into in huge depth, but we're going to go into some of the general concepts and, really talk about the reasons why we're doing what we're doing and what's realistic for you, depending on how big your properties are and what your particular needs are. So we would love to find out a little bit more about you. So we see that, there are a number of our neighbors from the Shenandoah Valley, which is a beautiful area of Virginia. You should visit if you have never, that's once the world reopens, of course. And a number of other Virginians, fellow East Coasters, but also Midwesterners, people from the West, US, and a number of international visitors. A lot of you are on smaller properties under 1 acre, and much of what we're going to be talking about today can be scaled. It can be done in a flower bed, or it can be done in acres of meadows. So it's really your call based on how much land you have and how much land you want to convert. And I think everybody's almost interested in pollinator and wildlife habitat, which is fantastic because we will be talking about that quite a bit, and in lawn replacement, which is of course the main topic. And edible landscaping, planting, riparian buffers. We'll talk a little bit about the concepts of invasive plants and why you want to get rid of them. For us, for Sustainability Matters, I think a lot of us came to conservation through our personal experiences and really through what we were doing at home and what we wanted to do. So I grew up outside Boston in Massachusetts in an area that was rural when I was growing up and really became increasingly suburban. So when I was a kid, we had a lot of trees in the yard. There was a huge forest behind the house that I used to take walks in. And, as I sort of got a little older, entered my teens, there were new neighbors that were moving in and they were cutting down all the trees and they were putting in grass everywhere. My mother and I were making fun of it, getting fed off. Isn't that ridiculous? Look, they have these people, they're always mowing, they're always doing all this stuff. But my mother became the minority. And by the time that she passed away, she was really the only one in the neighborhood that had kept all of her trees. That forest behind me that I had grown up walking in had been clear cut. And there were McMansions built on it, big houses with lots and lots of lawn and almost nothing else. And a huge amount of the American suburbs, of the suburbs worldwide, really have gone in this direction. So I think for me, it has been very important in my piece of the world to be trying to bring it back to that. So actually what you see here on this slide and in my background is one of my own meadows. It's a former pasture that I turned into pollinator and wildlife habitat. And it's an interesting mix, and it's an example of kind of what happens in the first few years. So this picture is taken in the fall or late summer. The red flowers in the front are cardinal flowers, which actually were not in the seed mix. They weren't among the things that I planted, but there was a great native seed bank. And once the field was converted, it really came back, and I started having them everywhere. The purple flowers are called ironweed. They were in the seed mix. The, you know, all different. I had about 25 different flowers and grasses in that. And they're all coming up and they're all kind of spreading. But you also see that this is not perfection. So that kind of wavy grass that's right in the front near the cardinal flowers, that is an invasive. It is not wavy leaf basket grass, which is a really bad invasive in Virginia, but it is another invasive called arthraxin, which fortunately is an annual and tends to cycle out as the perennials get more well established. But I think it's important to note that with any kind of landscaping, unless you really only have a very, very tiny space, you're not going to achieve perfection. You're looking at getting as close as you can to what makes you happy and what will make the environment happy and what you can reasonably do. So something that I have learned over the past 4 years of running a sustainability organization is that sustainability is really a series of trade-offs. And there is no right answer. There are some wrong answers, but there's really a long continuum of right answers. And what's right for you depends on your particular circumstances. For some people, they want to get rid of all invasive plants at all costs. They don't care how much herbicide they use. What really matters is being 100% native. For some people, what really matters is not using toxic chemicals, no herbicides at all. And if they have to let invasives creep in, then so be it. Neither of those viewpoints is wrong. They're both right. And if you're on a small enough property, which some of you may be, you can go both herbicide-free and invasives-free, and we would strongly encourage you to. For someone like me on 21 acres without much help taking care of it, that's not so realistic. There's a lot of invasive pressure where I am, and I do use herbicides. I try to use them as little as possible. I use them when they will be the most effective, but that's my choice, because otherwise I would be completely overrun with invasives. I also don't get rid of all the invasives. So I think that's one of the things that you have to decide is how native do you want your habitat to be? And we'll go in a minute or two more detail about native plants and what they are. But essentially, do you want something that is native to your region, which is best adapted to your conditions and most beneficial to local wildlife and local pollinators? But it doesn't have to be 100% native. There are other perfectly viable plants that aren't. We would strongly encourage you to put in as many native plants as you are comfortable with. But that's one of the decisions you'll be making. How chemical free is, again, very important. Do you want something that you can maintain with no herbicides, certainly no pesticides, anything else? How expensive? How much money do you have to put into this? Where are you going to source things? We run programs called Get Paid to Go Green, which are relevant really only for people in the United States, but connect landowners with funding for conservation practices. So like the 5 acres of meadow that I put into my property and a lot of the invasives control have actually been done through grants from the United States Department of Agriculture. And so we do run these programs periodically, webinars and in-person programs out here, connecting landowners with funding to be able to do that sort of thing. But if you're doing it on a very small scale and you're doing it at home, that kind of funding may not be totally realistic for you. So you have to look at your budget and look at ways to share plants. A lot of these plants can be easily started from seed. We run out here, we run plant and seed swaps. We would encourage you to try to do some of that in your area and find people, friends and neighbors that you can divide plants and share. Really important question, how much maintenance? One of the goals of our sustainable landscaping education is really to try to make it as easy as possible for people and so that you will not be constantly out there. I mean, the whole point is not to be out there doing some equivalent of constantly mowing your lawn. But the reality is that the process of these things, like establishing any new plants, can be maintenance intensive in the beginning. So you might not want to do it all at once. If you're putting in a new bed that's going to have to be weeded until the perennials expand and establish, then maybe don't put in all your new beds at once unless you have a ton of time and energy. Final question, which is also a trade-off, is how human user friendly is this? You know, I encourage you to landscape for the benefit of the environment, but you live there too. You are part of the environment. If you have small kids who absolutely need a space to run around on a flat surface, you might need to keep some of that lawn. You know, does your family like to grow and harvest their own food? So then you might want to focus on some annuals, some perennial edibles, some fruit trees. Again, what works for you? And what do you and your family want out of what you're doing with your property? Okay, so what is all this fuss about native plants? Native plants really go back to the whole essential base of our ecosystem, which is that we need a food chain. We need an ecosystem. Pretty much everything that we eat either is pollinated or eats something like grasses or forage that has to be pollinated. So we need pollinators. Pollinators are butterflies, bees, some birds like hummingbirds also pollinate, bats pollinate. There are nocturnal pollinators that people don't necessarily think about. And they, so we need all of them to survive. And we also need our entire food chain to survive. What's at the bottom of the food chain? Caterpillars. Birds eat caterpillars. Even birds that we think of as seed eaters or fruit eaters most of the year, if you notice in the spring when they're feeding their babies, they aren't around the bird feeders quite so much, and which almost seems counterintuitive. But the reason is that they are searching for protein for their babies, really protein intensive food, and that means caterpillars. So they need the caterpillars. The caterpillars in turn need the native plants. Caterpillars, as most people know, are pre-butterflies. They are the larval stage of butterflies. And you see the adult butterflies flitting around, and they're these really glamorous, gorgeous creatures. They primarily have a liquid diet, and so they will eat nectar from many, many plants. They do certainly have their preferences. Out in our area, there is an invasive plant called the butterfly bush, Buddleia, and which is still unfortunately sold by many, many nurseries as something that is good for the butterflies. And people plant it and they see tons and tons of butterflies on it and think, oh, this is wonderful, I'm doing a great thing. I call it the bait and switch bush because not only is it invasive, but it also does not provide food for the next generation. So what happens is that native caterpillars evolved over millennia to eat particular plants that were part of their ecosystem. Those are called host plants, and they are native. And these caterpillars, it's not really like your fussy kid whom eventually will grow up and you can train them to eat adult food. The caterpillars have a very short life cycle. It can be a few weeks, you know, in rare cases, can be a month or two, but they don't have time to learn. So if they don't find what they need to eat, what they're genetically programmed to eat, they just don't eat. They starve to death. So if a butterfly lands on a butterfly bush on the buddleia and lays her eggs, and the eggs hatch there, and there are no native plants nearby, then those caterpillars will just starve, and you've lost the next generation, no matter how well you fed the adults. So that is why the native plants are so essential. And you also get super cool caterpillars like this little guy. This little guy is one of my favorite native caterpillars that I have on my own property. It is a spicebush swallowtail, and it's on spicebush Lindera benzoin, which is one of my personal favorite plants. It's also called Appalachian allspice. Pretty much all parts of it are edible, and it blooms really early in the spring, even deep in the shade. And also you get this amazing caterpillar who is trying to pretend that he's a snake. That's his defense mechanism. And earlier in his instar in his life cycle, they actually look like bird droppings. So they look really unappetizing for predators. And then when they get bigger, they evolve like little tiny snakes. And right before they pupate to turn into the butterfly, they turn orange. So this is, if you don't have the natives, you miss out on all of these cool guys that come to eat the natives. Okay, so what's the deal with grass? America has a grass problem. Europe has a grass problem too. Almost everywhere I've ever been has a grass problem. We have been taught that a nice lawn is a sign of success. It is a sign of tidiness. It is a sign of pride in your home. A lot of people's HOAs almost demand that they plant lawns, which is something we're trying to change, homeowners associations. And in many areas, when you build a new house, you are required to seed with grass seed afterwards for erosion control. So people think it's good for erosion control. And a lot of environmentalists are fighting this and saying, hey, there's a lot better things for erosion control. You need to be seeding with something, absolutely, but it doesn't have to be turf grass. And it shouldn't be turf grass. There is way too much turf grass around. In the United States, 40 million acres are covered by turf grass. It is defined as our largest crop. Crop being something that is deliberately planted and often irrigated. That is 3 times the size of the next largest crop, corn. You can eat corn. Corn is useful. Grass, nothing. It is, in most areas, the predominant lawn grass in the mixture is tall fescue, which is an invasive. It provides no habitat benefit. It's mowed way too low to really provide a home for beneficial insects or animals. They can't eat it. It's, that you can't eat it. The erosion control is not great because grass, as you will know, if you have ever tried to dig up sod, the turfgrass roots are very, very shallow. So they're really not performing much in the way of erosion control. Obviously, huge water and fuel guzzler. I know some of you are from out west, and if anybody's ever tried to maintain a lawn in Southern California or in the Southwest, you know how much water you use, so much that maybe your city is going to cut you off after a while. And unfortunately, in the era of climate change, it's becoming more and more that way, even out here in Virginia, which is usually a pretty wet state. We had a lot of people watering their lawns last summer because we were close to drought territory, and that was the only way to keep that really demanding grass alive. People fertilize their lawns. They put herbicides on their lawns to kill the broadleaves, some of which are actually native, so to kill the quote unquote weeds, things like clover and violets and dandelions. They use fuel mowing it, millions of gallons of gasoline fuel oil are not just used in lawnmowers every year, but spilled as people are filling the lawn. All of that and all of the toxic chemicals ends up in the watershed. Even if you think that there are no creeks nearby, there's something somewhere. And when it rains, that stuff will come out of your lawn and it will run down and it will end up in the rivers, in the ponds, in the ocean. And it's really toxic. One of the things that bothers me the most about the whole lawn phenomenon, though, is just the sheer wasted time. We spent enough time doing repetitive things like cleaning our houses, which are just going to get dirty again. Do you really want to be out there mowing your lawn all the time? And I know that, sometimes when we give these talks, we run into like the occasional guy who loves his zero-turn mower. And so mowing is his zen, that is his recreation. And we have to kind of find something else for him to do so that he doesn't need to keep mowing his lawn. But most people are pretty fed up with it. And I think would like to spend their time on something else, something more productive, something that maybe leads to more beauty and is more interesting to look at. One clarification, I guess I should make, is that not all grass is bad. There are native grasses that are very good, that have great erosion control benefits, and that are essential for many native animals and pollinators and insects. So grass overall isn't bad, but grass, as 99% of us think about it, which is want. That's what I'm getting for. Okay. So we're going to go through some alternatives to what you can do. Now that you've decided that you don't want your lawn, or you don't want as much of your lawn, what can you do? So the number one thing that I would encourage you to do is to put in habitat. We have less and less available for the aforementioned food chain to eat, less and less for pollinators, less and less for wildlife. If you plant these plants, first of all, they're gorgeous. The vast majority are perennial, so they will come back again every year and they will get bigger, and you will have to weed less, and you will not have to keep planting them or starting them from seed. And you get to see these flowers every year without doing anything in particular. And you also get all of the beautiful animals and insects that come with it. Does this have to be huge? Do you have to do a whole meadow the way I did? Absolutely not. If you have that space, great way not to have to maintain it, or not have to maintain it much. But if you're just living in a townhouse, even if you just have a deck, you can plant native plants in containers, or you can put just a little bed right by your house or by your driveway. If you want to take over your lawn gradually and be expanding, if you have an HOA that you think might be causing trouble, if you try to turn the whole front yard into a meadow, then do it bit by bit. Make it really clear that it's a bed, and choose your plants wisely. Plant a variety of heights, and just things that will go well together. It's good to plant it so that you have something blooming at all times of year. Not all pollinators are active at the same time. So you want something that starts really early in the season all the way to the end of the season. One of the ones, that's grows out here that is actually the #1 plant for biodiversity, that has the largest number of pollinators attracted to it, is goldenrod, which people think they're allergic to because they're actually allergic to something called ragweed, which blooms at the same time. People view it as a weed. Gorgeous plant, blooms very, very late, and that's why it attracts so many pollinators, because there's very little else blooming then. So a lot of them really need this before they end their life cycles or tuck themselves or their eggs in for the winter. So you should go with mostly natives if you're creating pollinator or wildlife habitat. It does not have to be 100% natives. So a lot of people plant things like zinnias or Mexican sunflowers in our area, which are not native, but they are really appealing to pollinators and they are really important. And as long as you intersperse those with enough native plants that you're sure that the caterpillars will have food, it's a great thing, it's a great thing to attract the beneficial insects. Remember trees and evergreens. Trees are the best. If you have space for trees, this world needs more trees. They are better for erosion control. They are better carbon sinks. They are better environmentally. They provide all kinds of habitat. And definitely, if you don't have any evergreen trees, consider putting some of those in. The birds need shelter for the winter from predators, from the cold, and evergreens provide for birds and for beneficial insects some really needed shelter during the most vulnerable time of the year. And also, you know, if you live in a neighborhood where you can see your neighbors and you don't necessarily want to see your neighbors, you might prefer to see a nice holly tree, for example, and the birds who are eating the berries on that holly tree. So we would definitely encourage you to plant that. Another nice thing about the natives is that they often have edible uses and herbal uses. You know, most traditional herbal medicine in all parts of the world came from native plants because that was what was there. And so it's always fascinating to learn what those uses are and really see what you can do with these plants. One that grows out here, bee balm, was discovered the patriotic tea in the American Revolution. There was a famous episode called the Boston Tea Party when the American colonists threw all of the tea that the English had brought overboard into Boston Harbor because they didn't want to pay taxes. And anyway, they had no tea, but they were pretty much tea addicted. So they started drinking this native plant called bee balm, Monarda. And so for a historic herb use workshop that we did at the State Arboretum in Virginia, we made bee balm tea and people drank it. And it was kind of fun because I have several kinds of different bee balm growing in my meadows and in my yard, and just tasting and seeing what made the best tea. And it was all actually really good. So I now drink bee balm tea anyway. The one, I guess, disadvantage, depending on what your purposes are, that I would say that you get with the pollinator in the wildlife habitat is that for the most part, it is not steppable. This is not really an alternative lawn, as in something that you can walk on. This is something that you could certainly mow paths through. You can step around gently. I have paths through my meadows, but I don't play soccer. I don't run around all parts of the meadows. This stuff usually gets pretty tall. There certainly are low growing natives, and we're going to talk about some of those when we talk about ground covers. But again, this isn't exactly a lawn alternative for traditional uses like walking or running. Another sort of caveat that I would say when you're putting in the natives is because of what humans have done, because humans have brought in what are called invasive plants, so plants that are not from the region and that spread very, very rapidly, and essentially outcompete the natives. The natives need help. And so that means that if you live in an area where there is serious invasive plant pressure, that you want to stack the deck, load the dice, plant really aggressive natives. So pick ones that self-seed very aggressively. That is how a meadow or an area will fill in and outcompete some invasives. Evergreens are really important because part of what gives a lot of the invasives the advantage in an area like ours is that they either are themselves evergreen or they turn green. They germinate or green up earlier than the natives, and they stay green longer. And that gives them a competitive advantage. So, if you have invasive seed and native seed in the same place, and the invasives are going to get green earlier, they'll crowd out the natives. But if you have an evergreen or a close to evergreen native, then, you're heading that off. So this picture is one of my favorites in this area. It's called golden ragwort, Pacera aurea. And it's a wonderful plant. It's shown growing here in a shaded, wet area, but it will also grow in the sun as long as there's a fair amount of moisture. Spreads pretty aggressively. In fact, so much so that Amanda, one of our Zoom teamers, unloaded several giant buckets on me last year, which I very happily planted in parts of my yard that I've been replacing invasive vinca from. And it's got these beautiful yellow flowers in late spring. And then the rest of the year, it's kind of these low growing little green leaves. And so that's something that will spread aggressively. Stuff that spreads by rhizomes. Something I can't emphasize too much is the mantra of right plant, right place. Just because you like it, just because it's native, um, just because you think it would look really good there does not mean it wants to be there. I have made this mistake so many times. Pretty much every gardener I know has. You know, we pick where we want the plant to be, not where the plant wants to be. Native plants in particular really evolve to thrive under very particular conditions. Do not plant a spring ephemeral, which is kind of a woodland shade plant, in full sun, in a dry area. It'll die on you, and it'll probably have been fairly expensive to put it in. So you're just wasting time and killing the plant. You know, don't put trees in the wrong place. Don't put an oak tree, however environmentally important it is, in the tiny yard of a townhouse. It'll just get too big, and eventually somebody will chop it down, and that's going to be a problem. So research your plants, research how big they get, research how fast they spread, research how much water and how much sun they need before you make your choices. All right, one of the other alternatives, and one of my favorites, is edible landscaping. Eat your garden. You know, why go to Whole Foods and buy expensive organic vegetables when you can go right out your back door and pick ones that have no carbon footprint? Edible landscaping is not for everybody. Vegetable gardening, and by the way, we have several programs coming up on vegetable gardening. If you are in person, or it may pivot to virtual, we are doing vegetable gardening for the Plex next month at the State Arboretum, and stay tuned on our website. We have more coming up in that vein later in the spring. But it's hard work. And most of these plants are annuals. So you do have to start them from seed or buy the plants every year. But there is edible landscaping that is not annual, that is a perennial. Fruit trees are an obvious focal point. They're gorgeous. Again, research what does well in your area. Fruit trees can be susceptible to bugs, to blights, things. It can be a situation where you need to spray a lot in order to produce functional fruit. If you live somewhere like the Pacific Northwest, don't spray that much, or California. If you live somewhere like Virginia, you know, it can be an issue. So you want to pick carefully. There are, of course, a lot of native fruit trees, which are much lower maintenance and less susceptible to things like this. So in our area, some great ones are native persimmons, native pawpaws, which are these giant fruits, the biggest native fruit, and they're kind of like, taste like, to me, a cross between a pear and a banana. Something you want to check if you're planting fruit trees, particularly if you have a small space, is how many of them do you need? They are not all self-fertile. I once saw a webinar on edible landscaping where somebody encouraged planting a pawpaw as the one focal tree in your habitat. Now, pawpaws are great trees. They produce, you know, they're a host plant for a swallowtail butterfly, which is beautiful. But if you actually want fruit, you don't plant one pawpaw. Pawpaws need at least 2 pawpaws from different stock to cross-pollinate. Often they need more because they're a little bit fussy about pollination. So again, research the pollination if you want to get fruit from this. Companion planting is a great way to, first of all, fend off the insects and also fend off the HOA that might say to you, hey, you can't be planting vegetables in your front garden. Pick beautiful vegetables and intersperse them with flowers. So this picture we see, that's chard back there, and mustard, and a cardoon, which is an artichoke relative poking in on the side, interspersed with edible herbs, edible flowers. And these things, companion planting is a whole other talk, but they have beneficial advantages to each other. Some of the flowers will help fend off insects or attract beneficial insects to vegetables that need to be pollinated. But they also just look really good together. So it really looks ornamental. Vegetables can be beautiful. Variegated herbs can be beautiful. There are variegated versions of mint and sage and thyme that add a pop of color. And most of the herbs are perennials, actually. Flowers, lots of flowers that you wouldn't think of are edible. I cook with marigolds all the time. Violets are edible. Nasturtiums are amazing. You can make infused vinegar with them. all different kinds of things. The spice bush tree that I mentioned before has wonderful edible flowers and edible twigs. But again, the good thing about the edible landscaping, if you're going in the vegetable companion planting direction, is that it's mostly annuals. So that means that if it doesn't work out this year, you can try again next year with a totally different combination. Keep what you like or try something new. And again, we would encourage you to swap seeds with friends and or come to our swaps when you're out here. All right, so I'm going to be moving on in a minute to ground covers, to the stuff that is actually short enough that it approximates a lawn. But I think we have a couple minutes, and probably not too many, but if there are any urgent questions or anything that's coming up really frequently, I know you guys can upvote the questions, right, Sonia?
Yes, we have a couple questions that have been answered by our trusty staff of Zoom teamers. And at this point, folks, is there anything that's open still we need to bring up? I think we're all
I'm so pleased that everybody's answering everything already. So shout out to our awesome Zoom team.
I think we're all caught up, so forge ahead.
Okay, fantastic. So moving right along then, sometimes you don't want something super tall. So there aren't a lot of like short tomato plants or short fruit trees or even short, super common like native plants or native pollinator friendly, what you think of as meadow plants. There are short natives, but so what do you put if you have an area like maybe a hillside or a little garden next to your house or something where you don't need to walk, but you don't want to weed and you don't want to have a lawn and you want to have something more interesting? So traditionally, most of the ground covers that you will find sold in big box stores and a lot of nurseries are not native, but some of them have their virtues. And, we are not going to encourage anything that's invasive, but sedum, like what you see in the picture, it's very drought tolerant. I have some in areas where I want it to spread. I don't need to step, and it's very dry and I don't want to water. It survives the cold. It comes back the next year or doesn't even totally die off. And it certainly survives my not watering it in a hot, dry summer. Does not get very tall, comes in a variety of different colors and patterns. And, it's a decent ground cover. Creeping phlox is pretty common. Flowers in the spring, again, spreads reasonably aggressively. Violets, there are native violets. There are also non-native violets, and they're in the sun column, but they do equally well in shade, sometimes better in shade, depending on the type of violet. These are things that, they come up in your lawn. Encourage them to come up in your lawn, encourage them to stick around and really, become your landscape. Again, edible, host plant for fritillary butterflies and caterpillars. And just, really beautiful. And again, many different kinds. You can also experiment with different kinds of herbs, creeping thyme, Corsican mint. Those are often pretty good, fairly drought tolerant ground covers. In the shade, you have more native options in this area. A lot of them do really well. So the golden ragwort that I mentioned before, which again will also do okay in the sun if it's a very wet area. So I have some growing in the middle of my meadow in low-lying areas of cold water. Otherwise, it's going to prefer some shade. Wild ginger is really fun. It is not related to tropical ginger, but it tastes kind of similar and it spreads in these kind of heart-shaped leaves. Hellebores are not native to this area, but they are famously deer resistant, which can be a problem out here, and they do spread not super rapidly, but they bloom very beautifully in the early spring. So that's kind of a, daffodil-like herald of spring for many of us. Hostas, not so deer resistant, but they do spread quickly, and they, it's a decent for shade. It's also edible. If you pick the leaves and cut them off before they unfurl, you can fry them in batter like tempura. It's a kind of popular dish from Japanese cuisine. So that's kind of a fun thing to do if your hostas are spreading a bit more than you want them to. Another shout out for the shade, there is actually a native sedum, woodland sedum that looks pretty similar to the others. Pretty little white flowers though, that does well in shade. Most sedums prefer full sun. So you have a lot of options. The one thing I would say about most of these is that they don't spread crazy fast. You probably couldn't replace your whole half-acre or multi-acre lawn with these. You would need a lot of little plugs. Some you can start from seed, many you can't. And so this is more for smaller beds where you're not going to be stepping, you're not going to be creating big areas. Big areas, you want to either do the full-blown tall meadow or some of the alternatives that we're about to talk about in the next few slides that are also partially steppable. So here is one of the big ones. Some people like the look of grass, they just don't want to mow, and they don't like that it's invasive. So one of your alternatives is Nomo Grass. Nomo grass isn't a particular type of grass. It's a category of grasses that different people, what works for you as a Nomo grass is going to depend on where you live. And so if you try to buy Nomo grass seed online, you will find most of the purveyors will say, okay, this is what works in the mid-Atlantic. This is what works in the deep South. This is what works in the Midwest. So it'll be based on kind of your area. But there is one type that creeping red fescue, Festuca rubra, is native to most of the continental United States, which again does not mean that you could plant it in full sun in Southern California. It's native to California, yes, but it grows in more like shady areas in Northern California. It's a good grass for shade. One of the things about a lot of these, they're called fine fescues, so they're a little bit narrower and more delicate blades than tall fescue, which is what is in your average lawn mix. It's much more shade tolerant. So also if you have areas where you have been trying to grow grass, but it's too shady, like under trees kind of thing, then the fine fescues will actually do much better. The Nomos will actually do much better. There's some others that I have not seen sold in mixes, but Nimblewill is a relatively new favorite of mine. Grasses tend to be either cool season or warm season. So they either they're growing predominantly in the spring and fall or the summer. And Nimblewill is a warm season grass, like many native grasses, which is a good thing because it means that it will fight with and outcompete some of the invasive warm season grasses like Japanese stiltgrass, which is a huge problem out here. Nimblewill actually looks a bit like stiltgrass. It is fairly short and it has very, very thin blades, even thinner than stiltgrass, but it's a native and it's very aggressive. And I've actually watched it out competing stiltgrass in areas, which is very exciting for me. Buffalo grass is native to the prairies and is an option. Not so no-mow. I mean, it does get fairly tall. And that's another issue with some of these. It really depends on how tall you're willing to let your grass get. Most of these fescue mixes, and usually when you buy a no-mow grass mix, at least in our part of the country, it's going to be some natives that'll probably have creeping red fescue and maybe another native fescue, and it'll have some non-natives in it. It'll usually get to at least 12 inches tall, sometimes taller. And what you can see in this look here, in this picture, is it's got this very soft look because it grows and then it flops over. And it creates this kind of soft, really fun, steppable pattern, walk on, but it's not super, super short the way a mowed lawn would be. You can, of course, fix this by mowing, at which point it's not sure it's totally no mow, but it is less mow. Usually if you have the Nomo grass, you only have to mow once or twice a season rather than once or twice a week. So it's still lower mow. One drawback, not tolerant of heavy traffic. So it's fine if you're walking over it. It may not be totally thrilled if you're walking over the same path every day, same place. It's definitely not going to be fine if your kids want to have a soccer match on it every day. So it is more vulnerable than regular turfgrass. Another thing too, as you're getting it established, which you can establish this pretty easily by seed. If you're willing to use herbicides, it does allow broadleaf specific herbicides. So if you get something coming in, an invasive coming in, like say garlic mustard or, an invasive persicaria, those are broadleaf, so non-grass plants. And there are herbicides that are developed specifically for spraying on non-grass plants that won't kill your grass. So you do have the option to spray that. One final grassy type plant that is not actually a grass, but gets mention here, is sedges. They look like grass. They're totally different family. Don't try to spray them with grass-specific herbicides. It won't work. But there are native sedges and non-native sedges. The invasive sedges are way more aggressive, and you can actually allow them to establish as kind of a lawn. You can also make a lawn out of the native sedges, but it's going to be a lot more work and it's going to be more slow. It's hard to start by seed. You probably have to do it with plugs with lots and lots of tiny plants. So it's more work, it's more expensive, but it is definitely an option. Clover. Clover is one of the fun lawns. You probably heard about clover lawns. Clover lawns are wonderful. Grass, pretty much all grasses, are nitrogen consumers. They are heavy feeders. They need good soil, which is why so many people end up fertilizing their lawns and having nitrogen runoff and all this toxic stuff going into the watershed, because the grass is so greedy. And nitrogen is the primary nutrient that it consumes. Clover, on the other hand, actually puts nitrogen into your soil. So if you have bad soil and you want eventually to grow vegetables or something that needs good soil, a lot of people will plant clover as a cover crop to put nutrients into the soil. It is high protein forage if you have any foraging animals, and that includes deer if you want to provide for the deer. I'm not sure everybody does in their yard, but at any rate, the deer will like clover. It absolutely provides food for pollinators. I mean, it is a superstar. You see it here surrounding beehives. Beekeepers sell clover honey all the time because that's probably the #1 plant that they plant for their bees. And it's fairly steppable. As steppable as turfgrass? No. And again, I started experimenting with it around my raised beds, and that's an area where I am walking the same paths all the time. And I did wear down clover a fair amount. So it's good if you're not walking the same place multiple times a day. It is pretty steppable. There's a lot of different kinds of clover, but two main categories: perennial and annual. The annuals are beautiful. I particularly love crimson clover. It just beautiful, beautiful flowers, wonderful cover crop. Gets tall, not super tall, but taller than you might want for a lawn. So it can get up to a foot or more. And it is an annual, so you have to reseed it. Some areas it will self-sow more aggressively than others. But it's a wonderful thing to put in, like if you're establishing a meadow and you're planting it at the right time of year, when it's the time of year to plant clover. Put in crimson clover as a cover crop while you're waiting for the perennials to fill in, and it'll just be gorgeous and it will help the soil. What you probably want to plant if you want a lawn, though, is white clover, because white clover is perennial. You will also see it called Dutch clover, Ladino clover, intermediate clover. Clover is used so much that a lot of plant breeders have developed different types of clover to plant. But it's a wonderful option if it works for you. It doesn't always work. For some people, clover turns out to be too aggressive. For other people like me, it turns out to be not aggressive enough. And so that brings me to what is probably going to be the most controversial slide in this presentation, with the possible exception of the herbicide slide. I want to start with saying I am not telling you to plant invasives. You should never deliberately plant invasives. But many of us buy homes where previous owners have planted invasives, not knowing what they were doing. And so they're ready. We also live in areas where the invasives come in by themselves because that's what invasives do. Your ultimate goal is an invasives-free yard, an invasives-free property. You may not ever completely get there. What I learned the hard way, again, working on a fairly large property, was not necessarily to pull out everything right away, because then you leave a void and nature abhors a vacuum, and more invasives and often worse invasives will move in. So you want to have a plan with everything that you do. And in my opinion, if your time and your energy and your resources are limited, it is perfectly acceptable to leave some invasives that are already there as placeholders until you come up with a really good plan for replacing them. Having said this, there are some you should never leave. And so those include English ivy and pretty much all the other climbers, Japanese honeysuckle, Oriental bittersweet. These are the things that won't stay on the ground. They will climb up and they will take over your house, and they will take over fully grown trees, and they will choke them to death. You want to get rid of those. You really cannot say, okay, I'm going to let the English ivy grow for a few years or the Oriental bittersweet for a few years. It'll be so much harder to deal with then, and it will have moved all kinds of places that you don't want it to move. Some others that are less noxious, in my opinion, are vinca, pachysandra, which grows in the shade, something called snow in the mountain, which came with my house. It's also called bishop's weed. It's this kind of low-growing yellow, white and green variegated leaf. Again, these are not any of them things you should plant, but the vinca, for example, doesn't climb trees. It just spreads laterally. And so in my area that is now covered with Amanda's golden ragwort, I pulled out the ivy first because the ivy was just going up the trees. I let the vinca grow for a while I was figuring out what to do with it. Last year, pulled out all the vinca and put in Amanda's golden ragwort. There's still some vinca that's going to keep coming back up, and I'm going to have to keep pulling it. But that's one that if you can't get rid of it right away, it can be a useful placeholder to stop worse things from seeding. Now, those were all things that were deliberately planted. So then you get to the invasives that were not deliberately planted, the volunteers. So as I mentioned, I tried a clover lawn. What you see in the picture is what my clover lawn became, because the clover, while aggressive, was not aggressive enough to keep out the ground ivy, which is also called creeping Charlie, and the false strawberry, which I was really disappointed about because having lived in Scandinavia, I got really addicted to alpine strawberries. And when I first moved to Virginia, I thought, oh, wow, it's wonderful. They grow here. No, they don't. Well, they can, but what you normally will see, although there is strawberry, is this false strawberry, potentilla, and it tastes like styrofoam. It's very disappointing. But so I thought, okay, how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to get all of the creeping Charlie, which spreads laterally, and the false strawberry, which also spreads laterally? How am I going to get them out from amongst the clover? It's way too big an area for me to weed. I can't manage it. So then I thought, all right, well, it's still better than a grass lawn because grass is invasive, or turf grass is invasive. Let's see what happens. And so what happened was that I got a lot of pollinators. Creeping Charlie, one of the reasons that it succeeds as an invasive is it flowers really early, but that was great for the native bumblebees. I saw a lot of native bees on it when there wasn't much else for them to eat. The birds are able to eat or pollinate from the flowers and the fruit of the false strawberry. But It took over more and more until my clover was almost gone. For a while this year that I took the photograph was probably when it was looking at its best. This was around Memorial Day in May, and I had a nice patriotic red, white, and blue lawn at the time. Still wasn't super steppable, and I mean somewhat, but I have ended up getting rid of this option. First of all, because they are invasive and it does bother me, but also what ended up happening was that you kept getting more and more worse invasives coming in. So some of these guys could not outcompete the Japanese stiltgrass that came in and the invasive persicaria that came in. And it just became a game of whack-a-mole. Whether something like this would work for you if you have a space that you can't completely control really depends on what invasives are present in your area, what your particular situation is. I would say it is more of a placeholder option. It is not a long-term option. I'm reluctantly going for Nomo Grass because I don't actually want in this particular area something that gets that tall. But the Nomo Grass does give me the option to spray the specific herbicides. So we're back to trade-offs. And it's really different people are going to make different calls, but it's something I've tried. And it's something that may happen to you as you're trying to establish a particular lawn, and something you might decide you wanted to live with for a year or two till you figure out what you're going to do. Okay, so I know one of the questions we always get is how do you kill the grass? How do you get rid of your lawn? So we'll move on to that too. Just checking in if there are any urgent questions.
We did have one question. You talked about when clover is overly aggressive, but somebody had a question about planting clover. It did well the first year, and then last year the grass came back and took over parts of it. What should I do?
Yeah, so they may have had a situation where I did where the clover wasn't aggressive enough. It also can be a situation where you haven't prepped the ground properly. So this is 90% of establishing anything, particularly by seed, but really anything, is site prep. And so that's actually one of the questions that Sustainability Matters gets the most is, oh, well, I threw out a bunch of wildflower seeds in my lawn and they're not growing. Or, the grass is coming back. It's usually a question of not having killed it well enough to start with. So if it's something that was there before that's coming back, it's probably a site prep issue, unless you still have grass surrounding it and it's gone to seed or it's spreading, more back into that. And we're going to be talking about site prep now, basically. Anything else?
Questions about bamboo, which may fall into the category of how do you kill it, which you're about to talk about with grass, but several people have mentioned that they've got their neighbor's bamboo is kind of overrunning their yard. So I don't know if I'm going to talk about that now or put that off for a bit. Yeah,
well, I can just to that. Yeah, I mean, bamboo is planted as a quick growing screen. There's actually two types of bamboo, and clumping bamboo really isn't that aggressive and spreads. But of course, what most people wanted was something that was aggressive. So they planted the type of bamboo that just spreads by runners and it takes over people's yards. That is really hard to kill. And I am so sorry you're dealing with that. Normally, the best way, and you might have to do multiple rounds of this, is to chop it off and immediately stump it, which is, either spray from really up close or even paint the cut wound. And you really have to do this within like a minute or two or a few minutes of cutting it with undiluted herbicide. Which, by the way, will connect to the rest of the bamboo, so you could end up killing the whole stand, which you probably don't care about at this point. But just FYI. That's it. Anything else?
We had a question on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And we have Austin who said that he's got approximately 2 acres that he'd like to change from grass to meadow, and he would like some suggestions other than going to our get paid to go green session. Is there anything you can suggest for him?
Suggestions of what to plant, how to prepare it, or how to get it funded.
Well,
Do we
the
know?
funding, he can definitely look at the get paid to go green,
Mm-hmm.
because that would be very
Yep.
beneficial.
Yep.
But you had mentioned pawpaws. He was thinking pecans, chestnuts. Would that all be under that program? Or I know you're going to talk about site prep now, so maybe that'll give him some insight of what he would want to put in.
Okay.
But is
Well,
there
I would
anything?
say it sounds like he's thinking of planting more of a forest or a food forest, which is a great idea. It's not a meadow. But there are programs that are available for planting trees. Depending on where he lives, it would depend on what type of, trees they would cover, what they would make available. Different states have different regulations for, what they'll cover. It would be really hard to find anything that would pay for chestnuts realistically, because they're so rare. But, if he's living in a right area, he might be able to get funding for pecans. Certainly pawpaws, it would be hard to get a meadow of pawpaws started, just because they're incredibly fussy when you start them. And they're very annoying. They require shade when they're just getting started, and then they want sun. And I think KT, here, I know that you erected a really elaborate shade structure for your pawpaws when they were babies, I think. So they can be a little bit fussy for getting started, but certainly there are options. I would suggest, if he's interested in both the funding and what to plant, contacting your local NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service office. They're part of USDA, the US Department of Ag, and they provide both funding and advice, and they will give you the advice even if you are not eligible for the funding. So they usually have experts who can come out and look at your land and say, hey, I think you should plant this here or that here, and help you come up with a seed mix if you want to go the meadow route. Your local Department of Forestry can also potentially come out and advise you on trees that would work and funding options for the trees. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to move on to killing the grass. So what you see here, and as well, as I've mentioned, site prep is 90% of it. Planning, which includes site prep, is essential. I have made so many mistakes by just jumping into things. Like, I want to get rid of this. It's invasive. I don't like it. And not preparing the ground well enough for what I was going to put there, or not even knowing what I was going to put in there. So what you see here is actually a cautionary tale. This is Sustainability Matters official spokescat, because yes, we are an organization that has an official spokescat. In case you hadn't noticed, we try to make things fun. And his name is Chaim, and he is peering from a jungle of that invasive Japanese stilt grass. What happened was that I had an area of grass, like more turf grass, living that I really wanted to get rid of. I didn't plan well enough, and I didn't have a succession plan. And so what came up was stilt grass, and it was a whole little meadow of it. Fortunately, a lot of it ended up getting out competed by a wonderful native that was also growing in the area, jewelweed, which is a wonderful summer warm season native plant that grows in kind of wet, shady areas. But that, more than anything, really taught me that you have to plan. Do not leave a void. Don't just go out and kill. Timing is everything. Not only do you need to know what you're going to plant, but you have to do it at the right time of year. You have to do it when your grass is vulnerable to whatever method you're using. And we're going to talk about methods in a minute. But if you're spraying herbicide, you have to spray it when the grass is growing actively. And that will depend on whether it's a warm season or cool season grass. If you are solarizing, which means covering it with thick plastic, you have to do that when it's the hottest time of the year. You also have to do it when right after you've killed your grass is the right time to plant whatever you're going to put in afterwards, because otherwise you end up leaving the void for a while. So some seeds can be put in at any time of year, but it's going to be a while before they germinate, in which case you want to put in cover crop seeds with them or nurse crop. You know, some plugs, if you're planting actual plants, need to be planted at a time of year when they've got a chance to grow and keep them watered. Trees actually like being planted in the fall because then their roots can establish while the tree is pretty much dormant. So do your research, basically find out when the best time is to kill what you want to kill and when the best time is to plant what you want to have there instead. So for the no way, no how, no herbicide people, or for the people who have smaller properties and or a lot of help, there are lots of mechanical methods. Burning is not one I would suggest for people with smaller properties, no matter how much help you have. The obvious disadvantage to burning is collateral damage. It is a method that is used fairly frequently to maintain large meadows. It is traditional, you know, it's natural. It helps natives thrive and it helps knock down invasives. Burning has a lot to be said for it. It is not going to be the greatest for your lawn. There's a high probability that your lawn will come back from burning, or at least come back in patches. And it's also just not remotely realistic for people who are in a neighborhood on an acre or less. This is something that gets used on big swathes of land. So should you dig it up? And this was a dilemma that I faced when I was putting my meadows in, because they had pasture grass on them. And I also had, particularly in one of them, it was mixed with some natives that I actually wanted to protect, both small bushes called button bushes and some milkweed, which is essential for monarchs, ironweed, a lot of good stuff. And so I first didn't really want to use the herbicides. And so I thought about digging it or stripping or tilling. And it was obviously 5 acres. You're not going to do that by hand. It would have been a tiller that went through on a tractor. And what I was told by the USDA was that it would have to be done about 7 times over 18 months in order to kill everything, because I had such an aggressive seed bank of invasives and also of some extremely aggressive natives like pokeweed that I didn't necessarily want to take over the whole fields. So the problem is that it really pulls the seeds that are there up to the surface. And if you have bad seeds in there, then you're giving them more chance to germinate. You're also destroying your soil structure. And research is increasingly showing that soil structure is so important. There are all kinds of small organisms that live in the soil that are beneficial to the soil that do not like to be disturbed. This is where, you know, a lot of farming is going in the direction of no-till for precisely this reason. So the more that you dig, the more that you till, you know, the more you're messing up your soil. So that's not necessarily a great option. Having said which, if you're just replacing a few plants or you're just stripping sod, you could do that pretty easily and non-invasively. What you see here in the picture is an example of solarization. This is actually from one of Sustainability Matters' flagship projects, which is called Making Trash Bloom. We are planting pollinator-friendly native meadows at landfills. It's a project that has really taken off in the past few years and is spreading to landfills in many areas in Virginia. And there's a little video that we have up on our site and on YouTube that I would encourage you to watch. Sonia's probably going to put that link in there. But it's a really cool project. And one of the cool things about it is that people come, they see this stuff at the landfill. Out in rural areas, everybody goes to the landfill, whereas they may not make it to the State Arboretum or some of the other wonderful places that we work that are more traditional environmental education centers. So they see it and then they want to do it at home. And so what you're seeing here is not the final planting on top of an actual heap of trash, but it's a demonstration plot that we did at the landfill right next to the road in Shenandoah County, Virginia, to show people really what this was going to look like. And so we decided to start by demonstrating arguably the most environmentally friendly way to kill the grass that was there, which is called solarization. Solarization, you put down a thick layer of plastic. normally suggested that you use a thickness of 6 mil, which is about the size of what is called a contractor bag or a very thick garbage bag. Some people prefer clear plastic, some people prefer black plastic. What you actually see here is much thicker than 6 mil because we didn't want to buy new plastic for environmental reasons. And we asked the landfill if they had any 6 mil plastic. And they said, no, but we have 60 mil plastic. So 10 times as thick as it's supposed to be. And what this actually is a liner that they would put under a trash cell when they're putting in a new trash cell. So it's something that is thick enough that it will keep all of the toxins from the trash from seeping into the groundwater. So this was an experiment. And I would not necessarily recommend using this plastic because, first of all, it's insanely expensive. And secondly, it was so thick that it was hard to get it flat. And it's really important to get it flat. And it doesn't, but if you get it flat and you put it down in the heat of the summer and you leave it for a few months, essentially it fries everything underneath, including seeds that are at the surface. So it's a great way to kill everything without spraying or destroying the soil structure. It has a few disadvantages in that it will also kill some good bacteria. But on the whole, I would say that it is still if you have a space that you can do this, like you're making a new bed area and you're willing to tolerate having the black plastic down for a summer, great way to do it. And then you can seed or put your plants in the fall, which is a great time to plant. So that's definitely something I would recommend as far as a mechanical method. But again, like I wasn't going to be able to solarize 5 acres of oddly shaped bumpy meadows. So it only works for smaller spaces. All right, second most controversial slide of the talk, the dreaded herbicide. If you're a no chemicals person, I feel you. I respect that. And if you can manage to make all of this happen with no chemicals, do it. Absolutely. If you have to use herbicides, there are some advantages. One is selectivity. So if you're planning, say, to put in a clover lawn and there's already clover there and there are violets that you don't want to kill, you can spray a grass specific herbicide. So like I talked about the broadleaf specific herbicides earlier, the ones that just kill the weeds in the grass. There are herbicides that just kill the grass. And so you could spray that and it won't kill your clover and it won't kill your violets. So that is an option. And it's really hard if you're digging, you're pretty much going to dig everything up. If you are solarizing, you're going to kill everything. So this does give you options. You can also spot spray, which is how I protected a lot of the stuff in my lower meadow. I literally went around kind of sparing clumps of stuff that I wanted to keep. One thing you should never do is use pre-mixed herbicides from the big box store, like all those Roundup products that you can get at, Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's. No, pretty much every pre-mixed herbicide has a toxic surfactant, which is the thing that makes it stick to the plants. And that we hear, and particularly in recent years, I've heard a lot about the toxic nature of glyphosate which is the active ingredient in Roundup. Glyphosate, I mean, if you're spraying it for a living all day, every day, and you're not wearing enough protective clothing, it's not going to be good for you. But it is actually not nearly as bad for the environment as the surfactant that's in Roundup. The surfactant is incredibly toxic to all types of aquatic life. So fish, and yes, it will run off from your yard into a creek, even if you don't think there's anywhere around. And it is toxic to amphibians. And this little toad here, an American toad, eats 10,000 agricultural pests, bad bugs, in a 3-month summer. They're the best natural pest control. You want them around. They're also the ultimate environmental barometer because they have really thin skins. All amphibians do. And so they are extremely susceptible to herbicides, to pesticides, even to Windex. Before you clean the outside of your windows, make sure that you've checked for any toads in the window well, because you could be killing them with this. So you really do not want your toads to be dying a horrible death. You can mix your own herbicide with aquatic safe surfactant. So what I do is I buy an aquatic safe version of whatever it is I'm spraying. So if I'm spraying glyphosate, I will buy something called Rodeo, which is the aquatic safe version of glyphosate, and I will mix it myself with a surfactant. The one I use is Aligar 90. There are others, but that's usually the most easily available. You can buy it online, and if at least from what I've found, the least expensive, and it works with most of the major different types of herbicides. You want to spray at the right time to maximize effect. You do not want to be just randomly constantly spraying. If you're spraying toxins, you want to spray your toxins when you can spray the least amount and leverage that to kill the most things that you want to kill. Grass, again, like I said, there are cool season and warm season grasses. Your lawn is probably a mixture of, which means that you would have to spray twice. Because again, it only works if it's sprayed when the plant is actively growing. So in our area, you would probably spray sometime in April and maybe early June. And then you would get everything and you would seed with whatever you're going to seed with. Those dates are variable depending on how the weather is. When I seeded my meadows, it was an incredibly rainy summer and we just couldn't do everything until much later than we expected to. So there's some flexibility there, and you can really tell when you learn to identify your grasses, kind of what's growing at what time, or, get somebody out from NRCS or, another agency to help you identify that. Again, trade-offs. It's not a great thing to be spraying herbicide, but it can be way less damaging environmentally if you do it right than other alternatives. Always be careful, always read the instructions on the bottle. If somebody else is doing the spraying for you, double check what they're spraying. Don't take their word for it. Watch them fill the sprayer. Make sure they're spraying at what you consider an acceptable rate, because a lot of people will just be like, oh, the more the better. That is not true. Be careful, but don't necessarily rule it out unless you have other viable ways to do it. So that is pretty much, the end of an overview of kind of why you should replace your grass, what you could do instead, and, how to get rid of it. And again, depending on where you are, your situation is going to vary. Your native plants are going to vary. Your timing is going to vary. So we would encourage you to research that thoroughly, and reach out to us with questions. Check out our website and the various programs. And also, we hope that you will end up supporting us as well, because we are a small nonprofit. And the only way that we can bring free webinars like this to large groups of people like you guys is by the support of our members. So for those of you, in the United States, I always feel when I'm making these pleas that I sound a little bit like PBS, the public broadcasting service, or our public television. But it really is true that we can only bring you this programming with your support, and with more support, we can bring you more of it. So we would love to be able to do that, and we would really appreciate that. And like PBS, there are actually tote bags involved in this too. So if you live close enough to come to our events, members get tote bags, completely recycled, of course. But yeah, so definitely, we run a lot of different programming. We run programming in, as I said, areas of growing and preserving your own food, sustainable agriculture, sustainable business, but listing here a few that I think might be of particular interest to this audience. If you go to our YouTube channel, you will find the Native Virginia Now series of videos, it was one of our pandemic endeavors. It's a fun series of videos made by a couple of local landowners, Jeff and Allie Carithers, kind of showing what was blooming in their meadows at the time and talking about how they established them. And it's really fun. Jeff and Allie bring a sense of humor to it. So this is not a boring nature program in any way. There's a lot of life in it. Making trash bloom, as I already mentioned, and this picture here is actually of the pilot plot, that thing that you saw being solarized after it had come up and was blooming, and all the pickup trucks full of trash were driving right past it. If you're out here in Virginia or even nationally, because we just got a grant to start expanding this nationally, Making Trash Bloom may be coming to a landfill near you. Get Paid to Go Green, as I mentioned, these are the programs that connect people with state and federal funding for putting in conservation practices on your land. So check these out. Coming up, we have a few things very excitingly right now, or at 3:30, starting right after this. We have a volunteer information session. We are still largely volunteer powered. The Zoom team that you see here is all amazing volunteers. For a couple of them who are clearly rocking it, it is their first volunteer event. So we have a lot of virtual volunteers and in-person volunteers, lots of different opportunities, people doing specialized skills. Lauren, who's on our Zoom team today, is a graphic designer, and she actually designed the template for the slides that I just present here. We're always looking for videographers, photographers, people with skills like grant writing. Come check us out. We'll actually be pivoting to a Zoom meeting as opposed to a Zoom webinar, because in the Zoom meeting we can actually see your faces and talk to you. So Sonia's going to put the information in the chat for those who are interested in coming to the volunteer information session. You go into, so we'll shut this down and you'll connect to the meeting using the Zoom link. Some of you have signed up already. If you are going directly through the Zoom link, make sure that you use the password SM, as in Sustainability Matters, both capitals. We also have Vegetable Garden for the Perplexed coming up on February 6th, which you can find out on our website in the link in front, below. That is theoretically scheduled as an in-person event at the State Arboretum of Virginia. It's very likely it's going virtual. In a few months, we are partnering with a local wildlife rehabber, wildlife hospital, on native gardens for our woodland neighbors. So how to put in a shade garden that is very wildlife friendly. For those who are local to the Valley, in Harrisonburg, City of Harrisonburg at Friendly City Food Co-op, we are hosting one of our huge community plant swaps on May 14th, and definitely recruiting volunteers to help with that. And finally, in June, Preserving for the Perplexed, how to preserve all that wonderful stuff that you're growing in your garden. It is often canning and preserving is a little scary, to me included. I'm not teaching this, but Jen, who is on here, is one of the people who will be teaching it. And so she and a couple of our other merry band are going to be showing people how to, how to make your jam so that it tastes great and nobody gets botulism, and it doesn't really, it's not really that hard, or at least that's what they tell me. So that will be a series of virtual events in June. I think they're doing jam, yogurt, and pickles. So for those of you who are here in the States, have a great rest of the day. For our European friends, sleep tight. For our Australian friends, we hope that you can get some sleep now. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.